We have been studying the four forms that the horse of the world takes. He becomes higher and carries the gods, Vajra, and carries the Gandharvas, Arvan, and carries the Titans, Ashva, and carries mankind. And in Sri Aurobindo's commentary, Sri Aurobindo has gone deep into the philology, the etymology, and of each of these names, describing the characteristics which are then represented in the beings that the horse carries. In the portion we read last time, Sri Aurobindo took us deep into root meanings, and we saw how words emerge and the meanings unfold in layers, and even over time they change by association. In the characteristics that we saw of Titans, we made mention of their character of strength, their power and force, and I had pointed out that sometimes these are beings of great knowledge and even realizations. In the narration of the incident from the Ramayana, when Ravana was to be approached as a teacher of administration, of polity, I mistakenly said it was Rama. It was in fact Lakshmana, who was asked by Rama to go and receive the knowledge from him. But in the study, we also noted that this whole unfolding of the root meanings has been explained by Sri Aurobindo in some other texts, and I had proposed that we briefly digress to explore those texts and then come back to better appreciate what he is describing here, but also because this is one occasion when we can make that digression, and perhaps in future that occasion may not arise. So at the moment we will leave the text of the Brihadaranyaka and go to two little known texts which were published in the centenary volumes, in the volume titled Hymns to the Mystic Fire. And at the end of the volume, there is a kind of an appendix, a supplement, where texts relating to the language and the origin of language have been put together, not in any particular order. Here there is an article which is titled Word Formation from, and this is the larger title of a text which Sri Aurobindo had begun to write, Material for a full philological reconstruction of the old Arya Bhasha, from which the Indo-Aryan and Dravidian languages are derived. And this is the chapter titled Word Formation. It covers a little less than 2 pages and appears to be incomplete. Perhaps he wrote more, but those texts don't seem to be available now. And I read from this text, and we will look at a few examples, and then he moves into the essence of how language emerges. He starts with this. The language of man is not framed on earth, but in heaven, as indeed are all things that the earth soul uses in this mortal journey. When exploring Sri Aurobindo's writings, we have often to keep in mind that he always goes back to fundamental truths, fundamental principles, which are therefore, being fundamental, they are also eternal and universal. And statements like this, you will see, capture as if in a single sweep the whole universe across time and space. All things that the earth soul uses in this mortal journey are framed not on earth but in heaven. And of course, in this context, it is language that we look at. And this suggests already several things. There is a formulation that comes from the ancient European wisdom tradition that says, as above, so below. In the Vedic tradition, the formulation says, Yatha pinde tatha brahmande, yatha brahmande tatha pinde. As in the cosmos, so in the individual. As in the individual, so in the cosmos. And there is as if an identity, or at first at least a reflection made between the higher and the lower. The lower is a reflection of the higher, but not merely reflection, it is also a representation. Everything which is to be used in the material expression in the soul's journey originates in the heavens and then is given a material representation. And so it is also with the language of man. And how is it framed? He says, by the threefold energy of eternal truth, manifesting force, and sustaining delight, everything is created as a type in the world of ideas, the Mahat of the ancients, in the principle of a self manifest and perfectly arranged knowledge. It is diversely developed by the more discursive but less sure footed agencies of intellectual mind. So, here again in this statement, although he is focused on language, the statement itself applies to everything in manifestation. There is a threefold energy: eternal truth, manifesting force, and sustaining delight. And by this threefold energy, everything is created. So, not only words formation, not only language, but everything in creation. And you will see these three energies are in fact the Sat, the Chit, and the Ananda, the upper three levels or principles of consciousness. Eternal truth is the Sat, the manifesting force is the consciousness as force, Chit Shakti, and the sustaining delight is the Ananda. So all things which are manifested trace themselves back in their root to the Satchit Ananda and the threefold energy which pours to create. Now, when we say Satchidananda, we tend to think of these as domains, but more essentially, we must look at these as principles. And the entire universe, you will remember, is cast out in an outburst of seven principles: the Sat, which is the truth, the sheer existence; Chit Shakti, consciousness force; the Ananda, the delight; and then the Mahas, which is the organizing principle which takes all this infinite potential and possibility and puts it in order, puts it in right relation, arranges, and this is the supermind. And then out of that, it moves to manifest, where all is arranged in an essential oneness. All things move out into multiplicity, into increasing sense of separation as the oneness is forgotten and consciousness concentrates on individual specifics, forms, separations, multiplicity. And then the domain of mind appears, or the principle of mind, where all things are seen in relationships of separateness. And then the domain of life force, or the principle of life force, where all things are in relation of energy. And finally, the material form, which has this objective appearance, sustained form, but also complete loss of connection with the origin, there is as if complete separation and fragmentation in chaos, in darkness, loss of consciousness. But here the principle is this sustaining form. So if you look at seven principles, you see how everything that exists in the material world is backed by seven principles. And to the extent that it is backed and supported or formed out of these seven principles working together, it also has its equivalent source, origin, or representation in all of those seven worlds. Even in the material, most gross form of, let's say, a flower, there is a basis in the subtle physical, of which this is the gross physical form. And behind that, there is a basis in the vital, in the mental, in the mahas, in the ananda, in the chit, and the sat. Because all these principles are working together to give it form. So, first, it starts with the threefold energy. There is an eternal truth in which all simply is the divine consciousness. There is nothing else. And that divine consciousness sees itself, experiences itself innumerably. And in its seeing of consciousness, there is also the force of expression of what it sees itself to be. And this is the manifesting force. When you see yourself and see in yourself a potential, the very act of seeing draws out that potential. And this is the manifesting force. And the drawing out into expression is carried forward by a sustaining delight. And you see how this movement is reflected in the human experience. The artist dwells in himself, feels the mood of his consciousness, and draws out that mood and enjoys the delight of drawing out, giving form and expression to that mood, to that experience. And you will see in every creation this eternal truth, manifesting force, and sustaining delight. So, by this threefold energy, everything is created. But the first creation, because it is right there at the origin of things, it is held as a type out of which innumerable specific forms could come. So, everything is created as a type in the world of ideas, the Mahat of the ancients. Mahat, the great, the vast, because the supermind holds all things in its vastness and holds them as vast possibilities, infinite potential. And it is held there in this world of ideas in the principle of self-manifest and perfectly arranged knowledge. So all things are held there, perfectly seen in right relation, fully known. And then from there it moves to the domain of mental consciousness. It is diversely developed by the more discursive but less sure-footed agencies of intellectual mind. This word discursive has two meanings. First, that one goes without connection, hopping across different topics. But the second meaning is the intellectual activity by which one explores ideas and forms. But this development by the discursive intellectual mind is less sure-footed than this higher knowledge, where everything is known because you're one with what you know. With intellect, you're not one with what you know. You only play with forms of ideas, not knowing whether they are true, not knowing whether they fit the way you think they fit. You're playing with pieces and trying to join them. After that, already, and again we now focus our attention to language, but this applies to all things as they move into manifestation. After that, in the domain of the intellect, there is a corruption, a distortion, perversion, and gradual breakdown. And it describes why and how. Imagination hunts after new variations. Memory and association corrupt. Analogy perverts. Sensation, emotion, pleasure C is violent and partial satisfaction. So we can see how this would apply generally to all things, but we will focus on language and word formation. So the first thing we find is imagination hunts after new variations. So there is a sound, a word which emerged from an eternal truth with a manifesting force and a sustaining delight, and there it took birth in the domain of infinite potential. Mind seized upon it to give it a certain form, but suddenly now we find that imagination is not happy with holding this single form, it wants to create new variations. So, see how that happens when a word has been used for a long time in a certain way. After a while, we get bored with this usage. We try to use the word in newer ways, or an idea has been brought and has been frequently used. We have got bored with the idea, and now we need to change the idea. In the last 50 years, this tendency is most prominently seen in certain cultures which are still young and do not yet have the burden of age. And we see this in America in particular, where every few years there is the new story, the new message, the new paradigm. And after a while, we have done the new so many times that now they start speaking of the new. We have got bored with the old news, and now we have to have a new. In Because this is still fresh in my mind, in one of the meetings that we had in an interfaith conference, somebody spoke of how we are done with old inter-religious dialogues, and now we have to move to inter-spiritual dialogue. So, religion has become a bad word, inter-religious has become old, so now we make it inter-spiritual. And I reacted to that a little and I said, each time we try to play with words like this, we are corrupting the meaning of the word. Spiritual, spirit already represents the oneness, overarching oneness in which everything finds its unity. And now you want to split spirit into inter-spiritual. So there'll be many spirituals and they'll have a dialogue between them. What name will you have to give to that overarching oneness? You'll have to invent a new name. And there was some discussion around that, and finally they came up with an explanation that interspiritual is when people experience the spiritual in themselves, they experience the underlying oneness, but they still need to talk, and so they have to talk from a different position. I was not satisfied, but I had to keep quiet because that was the nature of the group there. So you find this tendency of catchwords which are frequently picked up, they become part of a subculture, and then they are dropped, and a new word takes its place. So for a long time, they spoke of how something is hot. And then in a reaction, because now we are bored with hot, oh, this is cool. And the cool was the new hot. And after a while, they got bored of the hot and cold, so it became awesome. And awesome is something quite extraordinary. In the biblical text, for example, they speak of God as awesome, awe-inspiring, because he fills you with overwhelming awe. And suddenly this word was trivialized. Oh, this food is awesome. And you see how words are picked up, diminished, weakened, discarded. And again you find this happening repeatedly. But the first reason why it happens, and we'll see many reasons, imagination hunts after new variations because we get bored. We need to have something to spice up, to create variation. And in all languages, words pass through a similar process. These are examples which we take up now because we have seen them change rapidly. But given 100 years, in every language all over the world, you will find the words similarly go through the same process. Second, he says, memory and association corrupt. So a word, as it comes, carries with it the baggage of its past usage. And you automatically, when hearing a word, remember the things with which the word is associated. So the memory of how you learned the word, the associations that you had in your personal experience or in the collective experience, they all come and corrupt the meaning, and sometimes quite unfairly. As a symbol, for example, the swastika is a sacred symbol going back at least 10,000 years, symbolizing the creative power of the universe in its fourfold aspect. But just because it was picked up by the Nazi party and perverted during a period of great evil, the symbol has now got that association. And it took a long time to try to free it from that association. It was only a few years ago that there was a meeting of some Jewish heads of the religion and Hindu heads of religion. They sat in a dialogue, and there was a whole process of discussion and exchange to clarify what the swastika has meant in India, and not to accept the corrupted meaning which now has got greater prominence in the global consciousness, although not in the Indian consciousness. But this is a corruption which you have to struggle against. And some of these symbols being so profound, you can't simply discard them as you could with a word. Similarly, with words, we have meanings which come by association over time, and they drift and they change. In the English language, we find this happening when we read old texts. Most students who study Shakespeare are surprised by how certain words are used. But in fact, Shakespeare was the one who brought English language to its modern form, and yet we can feel a gap. In his time, for example, the word explain meant to make plain. So you would say something like, will you please explain the mat? So the mat is rolled up, you unroll it and make it plain. Now, by association, over time, this was taken to the domain of ideas. Will you please explain what you mean? Will you please explain this idea? Your idea is a bundle, and will you please unroll it to make it plain? And gradually that meaning has stuck. And today, when you say explain, it has a purely intellectual connotation, and the physical form of it has been forgotten. But if you were to go back in any language, go back a few centuries, you will find almost all the words had a very different meaning in the beginning and have evolved to have a more modern, specific connotation. But when we have these associations or memories of events in particular, there is a distortion, and you have to often discard a word. In the So the third thing, analogy perverts. So, for example, we could say a metaphor. A ship is plowing through the waters. You're using the analogy, the metaphor of a plow cutting through soil and applying it to the ship, and it creates a tremendous sense of power. The ship is cutting through the water. There's this force and energy which comes from the association. But at the same time, the sense of plowing has other connotations which do not apply to water. The ground, when it's split, remains split. The water, when it is split, heals immediately. And you cannot really extend the analogy beyond the point. If you did, then the meaning would begin to get corrupted. I had thought up a few examples of this which somehow have slipped my mind because I did not note them. But doesn't matter. So when you see how you push an analogy because there is one similarity, you drag in all the rest which is not similar, and therefore the meaning gets corrupted over time. Finally, he says, sensation, emotion, pleasure sees violent and partial satisfaction. Every word carries with it first a sensation. Soft, smooth, and sweet. The very sounds are carrying a sensation on the tongue. So you will say soft, smooth, and sweet silk ice cream. You would associate with things which have that slow movement. Or you may have another word, a pattern of words which goes hard, harsh, crashing, crushing, rushing. And you see how the word carries a sensation even in the vibration of the sound. And when we use these words, the mind seizes on the pleasure and the sensation of the sound. And already with that, we hold it in a certain way. And we enjoy it. We enjoy that play of the sound on the tongue. There's an emotion which catches a word, and then all these sensation, emotion, pleasure sees violent and partial satisfaction. There is a deeper satisfaction which is there in the origin when the word emerged with a sustaining delight, and that all comprehensive delight is lost, and a narrow, specific form of pleasure is seized. Hence, as a result of all this, hence, change, decay, death, rebirth, the law of the world. So with all this, everything is changing. So first you have change, but all change you will see tends to reduce and narrow, and so there's a decay, and eventually when the word has lost its course, death. And yet, the truth behind the idea remains. The form has died, but the truth remains, and because it exists timelessly, eternally, it must find a new vehicle of form to express itself. So, rebirth. Hence, change, decay, death, rebirth, the law of the world. Again, this is a statement which applies to everything. But now we are looking at it only in terms of language and word formation. All this takes place in the descent into the world of mind and the world of matter. So as long as it is in the upper three levels, Satchitananda and Mahas, there is not this decay and death. It's only when there is a fragmentation, loss of connection with the underlying oneness and truths from the domain of mind downwards that we have this taking place. This takes place in the descent into the world of mind and the world of matter. Therefore, now we come back to language. Therefore, mankind has one original language based on certain eternal types of sound, developed by certain laws of rhythmic variation, perfectly harmonious and symmetrical in its structure and evolution. This is an astounding statement. He's speaking not of cultures and civilizations, but of mankind generally. All mankind across time has one original language. Even now, when we speak all these languages, they are secondary, distorted reflections of the one original language which remains eternally true. That's why he says in the next sentence, this is the Deva Bhasha. Deva means God, Bhasha, language of the gods. This is the Deva Bhasha and is spoken in the Satya Yuga. Because in the Satya Yuga we are closest to the spontaneous expression of the divine truth, so the Deva Bhasha is spoken at that point. But even now in the Kali, where we are so disconnected from the source, the Deva Bhasha exists, although it is not spoken so much by human beings. It exists in the domain of the gods and is spoken by them. Now, what does that mean? And this sentence itself tells you what it really means when he says, the original language is based on certain eternal types of sound developed by certain laws of rhythmic variation, perfectly harmonious and symmetrical in its structure and evolution. If you go back to the pure state of consciousness, shorn of form, shorn even of form of idea of mind, but pure experience. And the experience which you have, which moves you deeply, when it expresses itself or when it resonates in your heart, its resonance there outside the domain of physical sound and mental vibration, outside that domain in a pure consciousness, its resonance is the living experience. And that resonance is the sound of the Deva Bhasha. So he says, eternal types of sound. Now, any physical vibration, which we call sound, always fades out or gets distorted, even as it passes through a medium. So, if somebody speaks from a great distance, you can't make out because through reflection and others there are distortions. But the pure sound in the original consciousness, it never decays, never distorts. The type of sound itself is eternal. And what we experience deep within us as a living experience is that vibration, is the sound, the creative sound, that certain type, facet, aspect of the manifesting movement as a vibration in us. So, for example, you are in a beautiful experience, let's say, perhaps sitting in nature, your heart is deeply moved, and then if you choose to move that experience into expression, your body will move or your mind will move, and the mind will articulate itself in and through speech, and it will use the language you're familiar with. But the language is only conveying what you're experiencing, which is eternally true. But by the time I have spoken, I suddenly realize it doesn't match what I'm feeling. And I say, but, and I clarify. So this is the reason why you'll find many people, when they try to explain what they think or feel, they say, let me see, and you start with one word, change, go back and forth. Having said it, you come back, no, I don't think I expressed clearly. You have a struggle to articulate because you're moving into a medium which does not really carry that original vibration. Even in our mind, there is a loss. But right at the origin, there is an sound which is eternal and types of eternal sound, which you can say have closest resonance to certain thought ideas and physical sounds. And that's how the physical language emerges. So first side is eternal types of sound. Second, developed by certain laws of rhythmic variation. So when these sounds combine, when these vibrations combine, they combine with certain natural laws. They move into expression in certain rhythms. So for example, I use this two very different sounds, soft, smooth, silky, and on the other side, harsh, rough, crushing. And you see the sound, all of them have vibrations, soft, smooth. The sir is a soft, rapid moving vibration, so rapid that it feels almost continuous. Whereas the crushing, rushing, thrashing, the r has a harder, different rhythm, but also k, p, t have harsh, sharp edges. And yet there is a rhythm to them, and they combine in certain natural arrangements. So developed by certain laws of rhythmic variation as they move to manifest, and even as they move, perfectly harmonious and symmetrical in its structure and evolution. So there's an underlying harmony which carries even while there is this separation and variation into distinctions. Now you will see these three descriptions correspond precisely to the three energies of the origin. Remember, eternal truth, manifesting force, and sustaining delight. So in this description, you see eternal types of sound, laws of rhythmic variations developing it, because that's the movement of the force. And then the delight, which is the principle that holds in harmony, harmonious and symmetrical in structure and evolution. Now, when you look at Sanskrit as it is today, and it is not yet Deva Bhasha, it is the first uh, reconstruction of Deva Bhasha, as we will see shortly. But it's the closest we have it. You will see the language itself in the alphabet is arranged in a very clear matrix. And when you pronounce it, in this way, as you move in the throat, it follows a very clear pattern matching exactly the matrix 5 by 5. So precisely that recently a surgeon, devotee of Sri Aurobindo, having seen this correspondence, being a plastic surgeon, he found that the best way to diagnose speech problem was to get the child or the adult to pronounce the Sanskrit alphabet and see which letters he cannot pronounce, because the letter locations match exactly the physical locations of the articulation. You can exactly pinpoint where it is that there is a distortion, and then by plastic surgery he would make the corrections. It moves from the deepest part of the throat to the most superficial part of the lip. So, just by the matrix which is drawn out, which matches the physical structure of the vocal cords, it's obvious. But on the other hand, you notice the movement is from something deep, from the seat of speech in the throat, moving through to the lip, where it takes the most exterior form to be released into the world. And again, very symbolically, following this movement of a deep, formless vibration emerging to take the most specific external form. We may go a step further and say the power which energizes the vibration comes from below the throat, from the heart region, where the energy, the air pushes, life force pushes and passes through the throat, taking form, early form, moving to most obvious superficial form, finally at the lips. So it's amazing to see how structured the language is, but also how it reflects itself in the biological structure. But there's something even more amazing, so amazing that people think it is artificially done. When we observe the chakras from the Muladhara up to the lotus chakra above and observe them with the subtle eye, we see each of the chakra has a certain number of petals. On each of the petals is a certain quality or power of consciousness, represented sometimes even by a deity. And each of those deities has a natural vibration of sound in which that power of consciousness is expressed. And if you watch the sequence from the lowest to the highest chakra and count the petals in circle, one after another, you actually go through all the letters of the Sanskrit alphabet. It is so amazing when you think of it in this way that one of the Sanskrit students and scholars from Russia looking at this said, it cannot be natural. It must be artificially drawn and imprinted by somebody who thought about it. But the reality is, this is the truth. This is the nature of the vibration of those petals or powers of consciousness in sequence across the chakras. You'll find these charts quite easily in many tantric texts. So he says, perfectly harmonious and symmetrical in its structure and evolution. Even as it unfolds with the same symmetry and harmony. In the ancient times, in all the schools of mystic knowledge, we find in the Greek tradition, equally in the Chaldean tradition, and of course in the Indian tradition, they gave great importance to the sounds, precisely for this reason, because they were a direct representation of eternal powers, principles, truths. in the material vibration, which we can wield with our speech. By suitably using sounds in certain sequences, imbued with force and thought and clarity, and perhaps even connected with an inspiration, one could materialize those spiritual truths. One could invoke them, evoke them, cause radical change, miracles even. So the obsession in their exploration of language was always to try to capture that in different ways, and particularly to capture this perfectly harmonious and symmetrical structure and evolution. And one of the great linguists in India, Patanjali's the grammar, Panini, sorry, Panini. I'm sorry, the name slipped my mind. One of the great grammarian scholars of the relatively recent Indian tradition, going back a few thousand years, Panini is known to have articulated this beauty of the unfolding movement of the language. Now, you see, when you have an evolution, it can go on unendingly. Can you capture all the fundamental principles of the unfolding evolution? That even after 1,000 years, what you have described will remain true. And this was the great challenge. And he articulates this in what are described today as grammar rules. But they're not rules. And if you see how it is formulated, you get a glimpse of the source, the origin of the knowledge. The verses start like this by saying, it was Lord Shiva, as the creative power, who swung his drum. He has a very special drum. As you swing, two sides of it are beating one after another. Who swung his drum like this. And as the drum was shaken, the rhythms of the drum unfolded themselves in the following verses. And then the verses start. I un ril rik e un I ouch ayavarat lan yamagananam. And you wonder, what is this? They are each of them, one after another, sutras, rhythms unfolding from Shiva's drum, each describing in sequence the laws of precisely what is described here, the laws of rhythmic variation, perfectly harmonious and symmetrical in their structure and evolution. And when you study these in sequence, you find they are unfolding like a computer program. First, the most fundamental principles, which apply everywhere. But there are variations, exceptions, and the second one picks on the most essential of those exceptions. So, a-i-un is the base. Rilrik is the first fine exception. A-on, I-ouch takes the next level, and exception one after another as if rules that you apply. And the result is a series of 2000 rules which are like a computer program, in the sense that you take any Sanskrit sentence, apply these in sequence one after another, and the entire sentence is decoded in its essential meaning. The whole grammar of joining of the sounds, separation of the sounds, the meaning by which they're extracted, it's all described in this series of sutras. And this has been actually written out as computer programs. You can type a Sanskrit sentence, the computer program applies these rules and tells you the meaning, what the sentence means. And sometimes if a sentence has multiple meanings, all multiple meanings are drawn out. It is amazing. Just to imagine that a language is so rational, logical, and structured in its unfolding patterns, and that somebody could catch that and articulate it in this essential form, in this perfect sequence of sutras, it is unbelievable. You can see he was a genius, but it was not a mental construction of the genius. It was the vision, the perception of the genius which made it what it is. So this is the Deva Bhasha, language of the gods, and is spoken in the Satya Yuga. Then, after Satya Yuga, then it suffers change, detrition, collapse. So first you have change. Detrition is wearing out. As things are used more and more, they lose their force, they lose their edge, their sharpness, their clarity, they weaken and break down. That's detrition. So with change, detrition, and eventually collapse. Innumerable languages, dialects, vernaculars are born. So you have three words: language, dialect, vernacular, each representing greater and greater specific local variation. The language doesn't change with the dialect doesn't change with the vernacular. The guardians of the sacred language attempt always to bring back the early purity, but even they cannot do it. It's a very suggestive sentence. So you're seeing here from the Deva Bhasha, languages form through change, detrition, eventually collapse. Many languages, and from each languages further dialects, vernaculars, and over time there is this movement of spreading out, separation, loss of force, weakening, dilution. And he says there are guardians, there are deities of the sacred language, and their job is to protect the language. And so when something is decaying and distorting, they try to pull it back. Now imagine what this means. It is such a profound idea when you think of it, the implications. As human beings are distorting the use of language, there are presences up there which watch that and intervene to guide things back, to bring them home to the same meaning. When you look at certain languages, across languages, two words emerging to mean exactly the same thing. But if you go back to their etymology, you will see they wandered in a very different way. They had very different roots, but they have merged somehow to become the same meaning. And it's surprising. How did that happen? Or when a word is used repeatedly, and if the meaning and the quality of the sound don't match somehow, gradually the meaning will drift and come closer to the quality that the sound represents. If two words have exactly the same meaning, gradually they will separate to take on nuances of distinction. But which direction will they go? Automatically they will lean towards the vibrational quality of the sound. So if you take two words, let's say happy and content, and let's say for argument's reason that they were close enough to begin with that you could interchange one for the other, naturally over time they will drift apart. The sound of happy, the sound of content, and if you feel the vibrational quality, they will drift along those grooves. So it's as if over time, if you watch across thousands of years, the words drift first by usage, by association, by memory, and all those things, analogies which corrupt, but eventually it is the power of the sound vibration which pulls back to something which is closer to its original sense. The guardians of the sacred language attempt always to bring back the early purity, but even they cannot do it. Eventually, it has to be lost. When it's lost, what can you do? Something is broken completely, well, you can't bring it back, it's too far gone. They reconstruct it from time to time. So you take the pieces, or even abandon the pieces and start afresh. They reconstruct it from time to time, compromise with the new tendencies, preserve something of the skeleton. So as the language is changing, you're trying to pull back, correct. Certain things are too far gone, you drop, replace by new. Some tendencies you cannot avoid, but you try to keep the essence. So preserve the skeleton, and in the process, lose the flesh, blood, sinew, much of the force and spirit. So the analogy is the language is like a being, human being, or a form of body, There is the flesh, the blood, the sinews, and the skeleton. And if you think about what that means for a language, it's very interesting. Just this idea. It's not mere poetic description. The bones, the skeleton, provide the support, the fixity, the rigidity, the strength which holds in fixedness, not strength of movement, but static strength. The sinews, the muscles, provide the dynamic strength, the movement, the ability to translate into activity. And the blood brings the freshness, the spirit, the energy which sustains it. And the flesh provides the most outer form of the meaning. So lose the flesh, blood, sinew, and with it much of the force and spirit, but preserve something of the skeleton. So when they reconstruct, this reconstructed language they call Sanskrit. All else Prakrit. So anything which is not Sanskrit, which is not holding the purity as best as currently possible, all else is Prakrit. Now takes this analogy a step further, next paragraph. The backbone of the skeleton is composed of the roots of the original language that survive. It's very interesting. If you had to abandon everything in the language, what remains? The skeleton. Even the skeleton is somewhat retained. This is preserves something of the skeleton, which is the part of the skeleton which is the basis for the whole skeletal structure, and that's the backbone. It is around the backbone that the whole human form is organized. And we can digress a little bit, but you see how deep this goes. When you observe the formation of the human embryo, it starts with a single cell which multiplies to become a flat plate like disc. And then somewhere on the edge of the disc, it's as if an energy touches and a little dent is formed. And that will later in the grown up being become the base of the spine, interestingly, where the Kundalini is seated. So the individualized energy penetrates there, and then immediately it moves in a straight line right through the middle of this disc. And that straight line will become the backbone. Once the straight line is formed, the disc is split into two halves, and the two halves begin to fold. And as they fold, they join to become the frontal part of the body, and four corners join like this, folding to become the arms and the legs. And above, the head will emerge as a bulbous extension from the disc, not a fold there. Just if you observe this, you see how critical the spine is, and especially the base of the spine. It's literally the basis of organization of the whole body tissue as it will evolve to grow later. So the backbone of the skeleton, we're not even looking at the whole skeleton, just the backbone. And it's even before the bones have formed, just that line of energy. The backbone of the skeleton is composed of the roots of the original language that survive. Now go back to remember that description I gave of the Sanskrit letters, how they're organized along the chakras and their petals. And it's all along the backbone. And these are the root sounds. The language is as if the extension of the body from these root sounds. The rest is various principles of word formation. This backbone is composed of the roots of the original language that survive. The rest is the various principles of word formation. But note, he says, the roots of the original language that survive. Unfortunately, not all roots survive. When you have to reconstruct the language from time to time, certain roots are lost. And we will take a few examples from one of Sri Aurobindo's, the second article, which I will take up later, where he shows you how certain roots have faded over time, certain meanings also, and so on. So you have the perfect language of the Deva Bhasha, language of the gods, of which a limited subset of the roots that survive is what is the base of the new Sanskrit. Accordingly, in the languages of the world which are nearest to the old secret language, the ancient Aryan languages, there is one common element, the roots. So all the old languages that you can take, which have this closeness to the original language, you may find in the words they are totally different. Even sometimes the sounds and rhythms appear so different, but the roots are common. There is one common element, the roots. The elemental word formations from the roots, and so much of the original significance as survives variety of mental development, playing on different lines and to different purposes. So first you have the roots which are common. And then from those roots sometimes elemental word formation. So for example, is a root, e is a root, u, k, ch, t, th. They're all roots. But k then has formations ki, ko, ka, kam, kl, kr. All of these have secondary uh, forms and then combinations kim, kit, kip, kir, from which other words would be derived. So sometimes in these levels also you find similarities. And from that, so much of the original significance as survives variety of mental development. So as the language moved, as the cultures and civilizations spread out into their distinctiveness, he says something very interesting. Variety of mental development playing on different lines and to different purposes. It is as if that one manifesting power, as it moves across the whole earth, it moves along different lines to different purposes and forms different minds and different mental formations and lines of mental development, which become the basis for the different civilizations and cultures by intention. And it is as if the totality together gives you the completeness of the human life expression. So that's the reason why you will find everywhere the civilizations and cultures are different, but they're also complementary. Within a single space of one country, you will find districts, regions where the language has gone through dialects and variations, which represent already differences of mindset and values, ways of thinking which are reflected in the language. The object of this treatise, which Sri Aurobindo is writing, the object of this treatise is to provide a reasoned basis built up on the facts of the older languages. And now he lists some of these where you find this kind of similarity. Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, German, Celtic, Tamil, Persian, Arabic for partial reconstruction. So he is taking up these examples of the old languages, 8 languages, for partial reconstruction, not of the original Deva Bhasha, but of the latest forms commonly original to the variations in these languages. I shall take the 4 languages, Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, and Tamil first, to build up my scheme, and then supported by the 4 other tongues. I omit all argument and handling of possible objections, because the object of this work is suggestive and constructive only, not apologetic. When the whole scheme is stated and has been worked out on a more comprehensive scale than is possible in the limits I have here set myself, the time will come for debate. Over an uncompleted exegesis, it would be premature. So imagine he is preparing to write here a whole text unfolding this basis of language development. And I told you last time 40 notebooks of root sounds and the words derived in Sanskrit. They're still present. Next, which is the last paragraph of this surviving text, he describes the principles of how the root sounds are formed. And this is the fascinating part. It is very occult. It describes how the original vibration passes through different media of the formative elements and what it acquires through those formations, through those stages, before it can become the root sound. And we will take this up next time. And then the second text which we will take after that, which will also be next time, is a text titled The First Rik of the Rig Veda. We won't see the whole text, but just take a few examples of some words where he shows you step by step from the root sound how the word is formed and how the meaning is expressed through the roots across several languages. So, what he has planned to do here is represented to some extent in that article. So, this being the basis of the whole development of language, and Sri Aurobindo having had that knowledge, when he read the Vedas, he read it with this knowledge. Even when he wrote in English, in French, in Bengali, in Tamil, in Greek, or in Latin, it was with this backdrop of the root sounds of the language, which is why you will see he uses certain words in a very specific way. Even in Savitri, many of the words are not used in the conventional use of the English language, but in the original root sense of those words in the Old English language. So we'll take up a few examples of that next time. And it is with this background that he has been taking up the study also of the Upanishads and the Brihadaranyaka, when he studies the four names of the horse and the root meanings representing the qualities of those four kinds of beings. You can meditate on this. Maybe just read the four names of the horse and meditate on that. He became higher and bore the gods, Vaja and bore the Gandharvas, Arvan and bore the Titans, Ashva and bore mankind. It is my mother's birthday today, and she would like to distribute some things here on they're kept on the table. Please feel free to take.